Hello and welcome to Occupied Thoughts, a podcast brought to you by the Foundation for Middle East Peace. I'm Lara Friedman. I'm the president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace. Today is May 8th, 2023, and I'm very happy and honored to have back with me today the preeminent journalist and political analyst, Dalia Hatuqa. Dalia is a multimedia journalist specializing in Israeli-Palestinian affairs and regional Middle East issues as they pertain to business and economics, culture, art, and U.S. foreign policy. Dalia also writes about religion, minorities, and immigration in the U.S. You can read her work in major outlets around the world, including the Washington Post, Foreign Policy, Foreign Affairs, NPR, BBC, the New York Review of Books, The Economist, Time, The Nation, The Intercept, Jewish Currents, The Guardian, and Al Jazeera, to name a few. We're very honored to have you with us, Dalia. You can see her bio and a compendium of her work at www.daliahatuqa.com. That's DALIAHATUQA.com. And you can also follow her on Twitter. It's at Dalia Hatuqa. So, Dalia, thank you so much for joining me again today. And for folks, sorry, I didn't interrupt you. For folks who follow Occupied Thoughts, I spoke with Dalia just under a year ago, after the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh, and that's what we're here to talk about again today. So, Dalia, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Laura.
So, this week is a dreadful anniversary. May 11th is the anniversary of the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh, who was killed, as people recall, doing her job as a journalist reporting from the West Bank. I know Shireen was your close friend. I want to ask you, before we get into the politics and all the stuff around this, I want you to talk about Shireen, one of Palestine's greatest journalists, your friend, an amazing human being. So just start us off by telling people things maybe that reading all the news that they don't know about this woman.
Yeah, thank you for having me on again. I honestly can't believe it's been a year. I still can't believe she's gone. Like, it's something that's very hard to fathom, and it's hard to accept her death, especially when justice has not been served. I find myself like angry, but not surprised that, the Israelis have gotten away with her murder, as they have with hundreds of other Palestinians. Even when there's, security footage, when there's eyewitnesses, it just doesn't matter, but also I'm so disgusted and disappointed with the US administration. I know at the beginning when Shireen was killed, the administration had promised or made a lot of promises to her family and whatnot, but honestly, nothing's happened. It's been a year, and it just feels like they've treated Shireen like she's, a child of a lesser god or a second-class citizen. And like, one thing that's made me terribly sad was watching the White House Correspondents' Dinner the other week. I had attended this dinner many times, and it's kind of a big deal because the president usually attends. But at the event, and I do appreciate that Biden had made this promise, he made a promise that he was working hard to bring back Austin and Evan, two journalists that are missing or being kept away by various authorities in Syria and in Russia. And I was truly grateful that he was doing his best to bring them home, because, they deserve it. No journalist should be kept away. But it was both shocking and maybe not very shocking that he made no mention of Shireen. And I was just like, in my mind, I was thinking, who's talking to the president? Who has his ear? And who tells him that it's okay to pick and choose what journalists should have the kind of justice that they deserve. But maybe we'll talk about that a little more later. I think maybe I take solace in the fact that Shireen was so well respected and loved. This whole entire year, many people have talked about her. Many people have know her name, and you know, they still call her a symbol of a generation of Palestinian women who came of age in 97 when she first joined the Al Jazeera. You know, she was the first female correspondent they'd seen on their television screens. You know, people are right. She was a trailblazer. We all followed in her footsteps. But she was, you know, Palestinian through and through, and that was the driving force behind her work and her passion and her will and drive to tell stories that nobody else wanted to tell. And you know, she wasn't just devoted to covering like just the armed conflicts, like, and the daily injustices of the occupation. She did all that. She documented the invasions, the arrests, the home demolitions, the shootings. But you know, also at the same time, like, I sometimes go through some of the stories that she did, and she did some really beautiful ones. Like, she did some stories about Palestinian cross stitch or tatris, you know, the traditional dresses that Palestinian women make by hand and wear. She did several stories, like not just in Palestine. She went all over the place. Like, I recall a picture of her in, I think, in Yemen at some point. I know she's been to Egypt. She was all over the place. She worked out of DC as well. And it just saddens me, like, every time I hear her voice, you know, like there's now it's a famous video of her speaking in Arabic and saying, you know, something along the lines of, I managed to overcome my fears in difficult times because I've chosen journalism in order to be close to people. It might not be easy to change the reality, but at least I am able to convey the people's message and voice. And that's what she did. You know, she didn't try to be the message and the voice. She kind of used herself as a vessel. And I think that's what people loved about her the most.
Thank you for that. That was beautiful. I want to dig into some of the stuff that you also said. It's really struck me. You said children of a lesser God. I'm sometimes struck with the sense that there are inconvenient people in the world politically, and you can see that they're inconvenient for the politics. And I think that's something that is clear when you see the degree of interest and focus that you get from the United States government. When some American citizens are killed and when others are killed, you don't get the same degree of focus and interest. Depending on who they're killed by, they may or may not be inconvenient. So that comes in. I want to look in, just going back to the way her death has been handled. And you know, we both recall, I know, in the immediate aftermath of her death, Israel did what it often does, and it turns to some very handy tactics of denial, deception, gaslighting, deflection, and then, of course, the super fun one of blaming Palestinians for their own deaths. And I will remind people of the Israeli government official who immediately after Shireen's death described Palestinian journalists as being, quote, armed with cameras. And yet Shireen's killing has and I sort of say her killing and then the behavior of Israel around her funeral and those images which went around the world drew what felt at the time like an unprecedented level of attention and scrutiny, including what we saw, which were multiple investigations by major international news services, by human rights organizations, to the extent where it's possible today to point to it and say there's an overwhelming amount of facts here that point to culpability and point to a need for accountability, which we have not yet seen. Can you talk about these investigations, this battle of the narratives over her death, and this question of what happened, who bears responsibility, and what this debate says about how the media treats or reports on Israel's treatment of Palestinians? And even if you're, I mean, for me, it's striking to me that the degree to which the media is unwilling or is deeply uncomfortable reporting on what happens to Palestinians, even when it has this array of what in any other context would be seen as an overwhelming fact base to report from. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So the first thing I want to say is is basically that what happened to Shireen's not an isolated incident. I think the reason it blew up is because, first of all, she was an American citizen, and second of all, many people raised the issue and spoke about it to the extent where not just Israel, but also the US couldn't ignore it. But, is this an isolated incident? No, it's not. It's part of a pattern of Israeli attacks against journalists, especially Palestinian journalists and, other civilians, obviously. I think I've lost track of the number of times that journalists, have been tear gassed or shot at with rubber-coated steel bullets or live ammunition or whatnot. It's almost like it doesn't matter anymore, because even when you are killed, you don't get justice. So will you get justice for being shot at? I don't think so. But to go back to the investigations, as you mentioned, there were several investigations. They were all by renowned rights groups or media outlets, and they all ruled that Shireen's killing was deliberate. Even Israel itself said Shireen was probably killed by one of its own soldiers, but of course, they made it a point to cast doubt on the perpetrator and to cast doubt on the fact that the act was deliberate. And this is what Israeli authorities do. They muddy the waters, and they did that from the get-go when they first claimed that Shireen was killed by Palestinian gunmen. Till this day, they never retracted that claim, Even if you go back through tweets and whatnot, the tweets are still there, saying that, where they had that infamous video of some random Palestinian fighters, I don't know where. Israeli investigations, they're routinely announced, they're rarely conducted, they're never transparent or impartial, and they've been dismissed by human rights organizations the world over as exercises, basically, to protect the impunity of perpetrators and to thwart accountability. And now all these investigations have, however, also beg the question, why can't Palestinian eyewitnesses who were present at the scene be taken at their word? If it was anybody else, we would have been like, oh, but there were eyewitnesses who saw, what had happened. But, why should they only be believed when high-profile media outlets say what Palestinians have been saying from the get-go? And the lengths that the media feel it is necessary to go to in order to publicly reject or challenge Israel's narrative is extraordinary, mainly because it shows that even the media doesn't take Palestinians at their word, and because the Israeli narrative is so predominant and taken as fact. So it's very hard for Palestinians, especially journalists, to be able to be taken seriously, because whatever we say, we have to back it up 1,000 times over. So even when you look into the Associated Press and the New York Times investigations, for example, while they were very important, the conclusions they came up with, you see a lot of jargon and you see a lot of use of the passive voice, as if to say this bullet somehow found its way to Shireen's head, and not because an Israeli soldier deliberately shot that bullet and killed her. It's as if they are unsure of themselves, or if they're unsure themselves of what their own experts have found. And honestly, it's very disheartening, because it makes you feel like your word counts for nothing.
Yeah, I find myself thinking as you're saying this about, I mean, we all know this for years. The Palestinians are not allowed to narrate or witness their own history, and then until, for instance, going back to 1948 and things like some of the massacres that took place, the Palestinians have been reporting on for years. I mean, we're coming up on Nakba Day, until information comes out of Israeli archives and an Israeli filmmaker makes a movie where the people speaking about what happened are the Israelis who did it. It's not, it's still framed as anti-Semitic, conspiracy theory that no one shall speak of, because Palestinians speaking about what happened to them directly cannot be heard. I will say it's striking in 2023, seeing, I'm thinking about the Tantura, the movie that came out, I don't know, a year and a half ago, whatever it was. You have to wonder at what point there is a tipping point in the public consciousness, which says every time then the data comes out from the Israeli archives or the Israeli witnesses, and they validate exactly what Palestinians said. At what point are you going to start believing and listening to Palestinians experiencing it, right? When do you start believing people when they tell you this is what happened to them? But it's particularly clear in a case like Shireen, where you did have journalists on the spot, Palestinians on the spot, who who have been unable to be effectively believed. Something you talked about earlier, I want to talk about this question of justice. So obviously the quest for justice, for accountability, is still ongoing, and it's unachieved a year on. And can you talk about what this ongoing quest means with respect to the quest for justice for Palestinians in general, and also what it means for journalists operating this space? And you already mentioned, journalists, it's almost barely worth mentioning now. It comes as like a footnote in an article that and journalists were reportedly shot at this demonstration. Normally journalists being shot at would not be a footnote. Can you talk about that more, and also focusing specifically on the US? And as a reminder, Shireen was an American citizen, which is one of the reasons this actually has gotten the degree of focus it has, not just that she's high profile and well respected, but she's an American citizen. Although arguably, as I said, an inconvenient American citizen in this case, as compared to an American citizen who's killed by, say, a Hamas bomb, and then that becomes a reason for shifting all US policy and cutting off aid. Can you talk about those, with the American context, the contrasting roles of Congress and some specific champions in Congress who have been working on this? The Biden administration, which you mentioned earlier, has given lip service to concerns for justice, and then also US activists who've kept this issue alive in the United States.
So, since May 11th of last year, I've been pondering what the US administration can and has done so far to deliver justice to Shireen's family. And to me, I don't know what their sense of justice is, but to me, this justice is basically, first of all, acknowledging that this was a heinous crime, bringing the soldier who actually killed her to court, or at least telling us who that person is, because in my mind, it just bothers me that I don't know who this person is. It's almost like it didn't happen, because there's no acknowledgement that this ghost of a soldier exists. And this makes me see utter failure on the part of the US administration to not only Shireen, but also to her family, to those of us who, Palestinians who are also American citizens, who are, subject to we can be subject to death or injury or maiming by any Israeli soldier. And it leaves us to conclude that our lives don't matter as long as the killers are an ally. When, a lot of people ask me, they're like, oh, you're a Palestinian American citizen, you must have more rights. But quite frankly, I don't. When you call the US embassy and you say you're at Ben Gurion and you're stuck, they're like, okay, you're on your own. There's not much going on, there's not much they can do, or there's not much they want to do. And it's so sad, because you feel like the US is kind of beholden to Israel for some bizarre reason. And this also makes me think about other Palestinians who have been killed. Like a lot of people might not remember, there was a 78-year-old Palestinian American man who died in January. His name was Omar Asad. It was the January of 2022. And he died, when soldiers stopped his car, they blindfolded him, they bound him, they led him away to a building under construction, and he was found dead like the next day with a plastic zip tie still around one of his wrists, and his family never got justice. I think the only thing that happened was the Israeli military responded by demoting 2 officers and berating their commander. And this makes me think like, okay, justice and accountability. So we want something that the US gave to the families of, say, Daniel Pearl and Marie Colvin. Like the family of Marie Colvin, the American journalist for London Sunday Times. She was killed in 2012 in a rocket attack. Her family sued the Syrian government in a US civil court. Their claim, which was filed under the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act, if I'm not mistaken, was, a war crimes related case against Bashar al-Assad's regime. And if I remember correctly, the court ordered something along the lines of $300 million in damages. Yes, they're not going to get a penny out of the Syrian government, but the judge's clear ruling that Colvin had been deliberately targeted as a journalist was important. It was hailed by press freedom and human rights advocates. I know that Shireen's case has been referred to the ICC, but a referral doesn't guarantee an investigation, and nothing's happened in that sense so far. And we know that Israel and the US, neither of them are signatories to the ICC, so this makes enforcement in the event of a ruling unlikely. But we still have the FBI team investigation that more than 50 American lawmakers had called for. This was what had happened, I think, in 2002 in response to the kidnapping and killing of Daniel Pearl in Pakistan. So it's like, why are we picking and choosing? Why aren't we applying the same rules to all the journalists who have been killed or maimed or anything? And I think, yeah, as deep a commitment as the US has to Israel's security, it has an even greater obligation to the safety and security of its own citizens. And the State Department said as much earlier last year when it called for a thorough criminal investigation into the death of 78-year-old Palestinian American Omar Asad. And I remember the US government said something along the lines that they have no higher priority than the safety and security of US citizens abroad. So where does this leave Shireen? Like, why is she not being given the same accountability and the same treatment that others before her have been given? And I remember one time I was talking to Matt Duss, who at the time was Senator Bernie Sanders' foreign policy advisor. And he told me the reason the Israelis act with impunity is because the United States has taught them that they can. Because ultimately, it's up to the United States to tell Israel where it stands on certain issues. Because, you've got this, so much money, so much weaponry going from the US to Israel. And so at the end of the day, it's kind of sad to hear that, because it's a grim conclusion for Palestinian American journalists like me who feel that they can't trust their own government to protect them. I've never once been in the field and thought, oh yeah, my passport will be able to do anything for me. And that's especially true when I return from abroad to the West Bank via Jordan, because ultimately when I cross Allenby Bridge, I'm a Palestinian first and foremost.
Yeah, I remember many years ago when an activist named Rachel Corrie died in the Gaza Strip. She was bulldozed by an IDF bulldozer. I remember thinking, well, this will be a game changer because she's not just an American, she's an American American. You get the hyphens there, you know, this is a white blonde American from the Pacific Northwest. And it was something of a, I don't want to say a shock, but it clearly wasn't true. It goes back to, you know, inconvenient deaths. And that was not a death that in any way became a major factor in US foreign policy. I think a lot of us thought with Shireen, given her high profile, that this also might be one of those cases that could be the exception, even if it's the exception that proves the rule. And it hasn't proved to be that. I want to step back or pull the camera back on just the issue of journalism, and just as context, this is my context. You know, living under Israeli military control and apartheid, Palestine has for years, I would argue, and many would argue, operated as something of a laboratory in which authoritarian policies of control and abuse are tested and perfected on a captive audience of Palestinians. And then we have the case of weapons and weapon systems that Israel develops and then exports. And we have what people are coming to realize is an industry of surveillance tech, which is developed and tested and perfected on Palestinians, and it violates basic rights of privacy and safety. And that today are threatening those same basic rights of people around the globe because those same things are being exported. I want to ask you what journalists and media outlets operating in conflict-affected areas where you have, much like we have in Palestine, an illiberal authority with overarching power, what they need to learn or what they can learn from the killing of Shireen and the Israeli government's, I would use the term management of the aftermath in order to ensure its own impunity.
I think the first thing that I can think of when thinking about like the killing of Shireen and how it's affected journalists is the chilling effect it's had on journalists on the ground, because now journalists are much more afraid of going into the field. Like, for example, the last time when something was happening in Hawara near Nablus, there were a bunch of journalists, and you know, we were all debating whether to go, you know, to Hawara and to cover the pogrom there by Israeli settlers, and we decided that some of us would go, some of us wouldn't, and those of us who would go need to go together. And honestly, I don't remember the last time. Maybe the last time was in 2002 during the Israeli invasion of the West Bank. That we, you know, we kind of like came together and said, okay, it's not safe for one of us to go alone. And so there is this chilling effect. I personally didn't go. I didn't feel like I was up for it. Like, I'll be honest. And I couldn't get myself to do it. But also the killing of Shireen has kind of cast a spotlight on the high rate of Israeli attacks against media workers and the relative impunity under which they operate. So I recall Omar Shakir, the Israel and Palestine director for Human Rights Watch, said that the Israeli investigations that come afterwards, after things have happened, are whitewashed mechanisms. And I mean, that's the assessment that's been reached by many human rights organizations, including, for example, Israel's premier human rights organization, B'Tselem. Like I said, Human Rights Watch has a similar diagnosis. The reality is there's no accountability for these sorts of abuses when it comes to actions by the Israeli authorities. So many of us know that Israeli military investigations into the deaths of Palestinians often drag on for months and sometimes years without even reaching firm conclusions or leading to prosecutions. Like I was doing some research, for example, and I saw that Yesh Din, an Israeli human rights group, found that in 2019 and 2020, I think out of 270 complaints, 4 led to indictment of soldiers. And it's mind-boggling, you know? And one case that's striking for its parallels to the killing of Shireen is held up as an example of why the distrust runs so deep. I'm talking here about the killing of these two journalists. Their names were Ahmed Abu Hussein and Yasser Murtaja. They were shot by Israeli snipers in 2018 while they were covering the Great March of Return protests in Gaza. And, you know, like Shireen, Yasser Murtaja was wearing a vest. It said press. And like with Shireen, the Israeli military promised to investigate the killing after an international outcry. But then they started accusing Murtaja of being a senior Hamas operative. And obviously, they never provided evidence for the allegation. Murtaja's company had been approved for a US government grant. I mean, obviously, it's a process that includes extensive background vetting. So, you know, whatever the Israelis were coming up with wasn't true, but it didn't matter because it sparked confusion. It sparked like all sorts of nonsense that it made people think, oh yeah, he was shot by accident in the chaos of violence and, you know, and in the chaos of war. And it's been, I think, 5 years since then, and Israel's military investigation has not given any answers. And I know that there was like a brief statement that Murtaja's death was investigated by a military body known as the fact-finding assessment mechanism. And then the military prosecutors determined that there was no suspicion of a crime being committed, and they closed the case, and no indictments were brought. So if that happened to him, I mean, yes, Shireen is an American citizen, but like, it still doesn't matter, because ultimately whatever proof there is not going to matter, because at the end of the day, Israel is the prosecutor, it's the, you know, it's the judge, it's everything, and it's not going to go against its own soldiers, obviously.
Yeah, I have observed often that even when Israel does offer some level of responsibility, or at least correcting the record, it's so far out of the news cycle that it becomes irrelevant, and the news cycle remains. And we see this with alleged car rammings that turn out to not be that. We see this with alleged someone tried to grab the argument is they tried to grab a weapon and they were killed, and then video emerges, and 3 weeks later it's kind of it's out of the news cycle, but it turns out that was actually video evidence that it isn't what they said it was. And yeah, judge, prosecutor, jury, all in one. All right, I want to circle back before we close, because you've given us a lot of your time today and I appreciate it. I want you to talk again to close about Shireen, the human being, your friend, Palestinian, a woman, beloved family member, as we've seen with the incredible efforts of her niece and other people for justice and to maintain her legacy, and of course a brilliant journalist. And as I think you started out, I mean, Shireen was an icon for Palestinians and really across the Arabic-speaking world before she died. Can you talk about her legacy today, and what it means, and what you think it's going to mean in the future, or maybe what you hope it will mean in the future?
I think I've been seeing a lot of videos basically of kids going up to the spot in Jenin where she was killed, and they're being asked like, oh, why are you here? And they're like, we're here because of, to see Shireen Abu Akleh. And these kids can't remember anything. I mean, I was 20 when Shireen was like, I believe maybe 30 or 30 something, and she was, at the height of her career. So these kids know what they see, what they hear from the families, but still, like, it seems to be that her legacy is being passed down, generation to generation, which I think is super important. And I just learned today that Al Jazeera, along with the Ramallah municipality, is going to open what they're calling the Shireen Abu Akleh Museum for Media, or of media. And I think that's brilliant. It breaks my heart that like we have to do something like that. But to me, it's so important that we keep talking about her, no matter what year, I don't care if it's 50 billion years from now, I want people to remember her because she was that special. She wasn't just special as a journalist, as a trailblazer, as somebody who inspired a generation of women and men. She was also such a decent, beautiful human being. She was so down to earth. She was loving. She was caring. She took care of everybody who was around her. There was no air of arrogance about her. You don't see that diva-ish style that you see for, with many people on camera. Even though she must have known like how important her work was and how well known she was, but the arrogance did not exist. There was none of it. And there were things about her that I appreciated and that I still take with me, like the way she was calm and collected under pressure, the way, she would run, but she wouldn't run frantically. She had her, we have the saying in Arabic, like she had her brain in her head, which means that like she was very well grounded. And but she was also responsible and she was careful. She was always careful to keep herself safe, to protect her team in dangerous situations. And she didn't want glory, and she didn't want to be a martyr. She didn't want to be somebody on a poster. Whenever I remember the video of her like ducking, I know that she was fighting for her life and she didn't want that life taken. And the fact that she loved everything, she loved life, she loved going out and partying and music and all these things, she wasn't looking to be anything different. She loved what she did, but she also loved being an aunt. She was a great aunt. And I mean, I knew her family through her. Like I hadn't met them until after she was killed, sadly. But in her niece, for example, I found a piece of Shireen, and that gives me solace, and it makes me feel a bit better, because there's an element of her in Lena, for example. And I know that when I'm feeling down and when I'm feeling like I miss her so much that I can't breathe, like I'll write to her and I'll be like, I really miss Shireen, and she'll be like, I do too. But it's different when it's her niece, because it's a part of her and it's almost like I'm talking to her. And I just feel like, honestly, at the end of the day, I want people to remember her for both, for being a journalist, but also for being a woman, and just a kind person. And it's so hard to overstate just how much Shireen meant to Palestinians and people throughout the Middle East and beyond, and how much she meant to us as friends. We will miss her. We miss her infectious laugh, her loving and playful nature, her the way she loved her pet dog, for example. And I mean, this is all aside from her inspiring work. I mean, there's nothing that we can do to bring her back, but we can honor her life and legacy by always, always, always demanding justice and accountability. We need to get the soldier who, and the system that is behind the soldier, the system that killed her. We need justice from these people. And I know it's probably not going to happen, but I want to try. I want to try forever, and I don't want to put this to rest. I don't want Shireen to become another number, or another casualty that we forget about over time. I mean, all last week, I think there were like 5 or 6 people, Palestinians, who were killed, and half the time we don't even know their names, and that's the sad part, is that Palestinian life can be so so cheap and so unimportant, and it just doesn't seem right. And I don't want that for anybody, but I especially don't want that for Shireen.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you for that just we have all of us who didn't know Shireen personally have gotten to know her over the past year under the most tragic circumstances, obviously, but we've gotten the gift of some insight into this extraordinary person because friends and family like you have shared that with us. It's not just another news story. And that's, as you say, this isn't just about Shireen, it's about justice for all people. So, all these deaths are not simply numbers. But the ability of friends and family and colleagues of Shireen to in some ways force the world to reckon with a human being really, I think, breaks open space that didn't exist for insisting on the value of every human life, not children of a lesser God, not inconvenient deaths, but human beings. And I'm so grateful for you sharing your memories and your love of Shireen with us. So thank you for that. We're going to end this here. I know there's a lot of things this week around Shireen's death. I hope people will take the time and take a breath and read and learn and allow themselves to step out of the news cycle itself and dig deeper, because these are the human beings behind the stories are the story. And that's what we can use if anything comes out of this moment that is a big piece of it. So Dalia, we're going to stop here today. So thank you so much for joining me, and to our audience, as always, thank you for listening and watching. Again, I encourage folks to follow Dalia on Twitter. It's at Dalia Hatuqa. And finally, as always, I want to remind people to subscribe to the Occupied Thoughts podcast. You can do that on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Spotify. We have great content pretty much every week, including this coming week with the Nakba anniversary. There's so many horrible anniversaries here. And you can find also this podcast and the video for it at www.fmep.org. So with that, we're going to end it here. I'm Lara Friedman, president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace, thanking Dalia Hatuqa again for joining us and signing off until the next episode of Occupied Thoughts.